Yeah. Okay. So, welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University, and we're very happy to welcome all of you here to our first Eye on Africa seminar for this academic year. I'm not going to introduce the speaker because I'm going to introduce the person who is going to introduce the speaker, our very special new assistant director in the African Studies Center. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting her yet, is Dr. Awa Sarr. She came to us from the University of Tennessee. She was an assistant professor there in modern foreign languages and literatures, and also in Africana studies. She has an MA in French literature from the University of Montana. Her BA is from the Université de Saint-Louis in Senegal. And she did her PhD in French studies at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. So we're really delighted to have Awa with us, and she is going to be the coordinator of our Eye on Africa series, so we're just so pleased, and therefore I'm going to hand over the microphone and let her introduce the speaker. So take it away, Awa. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you everybody for coming. And thank you, Amanda. We're very happy to have you here. So Dr. Logan is an Africanist, archaeologist with interest in food studies, environmental history, and historical anthropology. And since 2013, he has served as assistant professor of anthropology at Northwestern University. She has published in numerous archaeology and anthropology journals. Her forthcoming book, titled The Scarcity Slot, Excavating Histories of African Food Security from the University of California Press, is the first monograph to investigate food security in the deep past. Today, Dr. Logan is gonna talk about, the title of her talk is Excavating Histories of African Food Security. And we are very happy again, Amanda, to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I might. So.
Oh, you have one. Okay, yes. So you don't need this.
Well, you could put your commentary in as we go along.
Oh, okay.
Thanks to the African Studies Center to inviting me here to speak today, and for organizing all the details of my visit, which have been seamless and very enjoyable. Because we're a smaller group, I'm going to be a little bit more informal and sit for some of this, and we'll sort of see how that goes. It's good to be back. It's nice to be in an institution where African history and environment and agriculture are all such strong components of the institution, and these are all very familiar themes in my research, as we'll talk about today. As Awa alluded to, I'll be talking today about my book that's forthcoming with the University of California Press. At the center of this project is a question that we almost never hear asked: have Africans always suffered from hunger? And if not, how was hunger avoided in the past, and how did it become a common and chronic problem? As suggested by the juxtaposition of the two images, which I put up here, one a feast at the height of the Asante Empire in the early 19th century, and the other less than a century later, from a colonial medical study on malnutrition, there have been major shifts in people's ability to feed themselves. Now, despite archival clues like these, food security is most often portrayed in what is a very presentist and timeless form, and images like this one will be familiar to many of you here. Graphics like this do some really important work. They call attention to the severity of food security problems on the continent, where there is a higher percentage of undernourished people than in any other continent. This present state of affairs, though, tends to seep into our understanding of past foodways, since it becomes hard to imagine a different kind of Africa. I argue that a lack of data about food security in the past, as well as a historical amnesia of sorts, means that Africa's food security potential becomes then flattened into the miserable statistics of the present. So assumptions of timelessness are one of the many ways in which Africa tends to be othered from the West. In my book, I suggest that African food and agriculture tend to be othered into what I call the scarcity slot. This designation builds on anthropologist Michel Rolph-Trouillot's savage slot, the way in which exotic others were stripped of polite manners by Western anthropologists who were studying them. This process essentially involves fitting new groups or information into predefined spaces or types that often have very little to do with empirical or on-the-ground realities. While the content of slots changes over time, the slots do act to keep subject and object essentially in the same structural positions, to, as Escobar puts it, ensure a certain functioning of power. Scholars, of course, are no exception, as we too are products of the privileges and prejudices of our time. Building on this work, I argue that modernist thinking has meant that the content of our imaginaries has changed to emphasize resources rather than manners. In my book, I look at representations of African foodways to expose three interrelated tenets of the scarcity slot that build on these earlier representations of Africa as a savage place. First, food is most often portrayed in reference to the lack of food, rather than the local tastes or the rich culinary traditions that have developed across the continent. This mirrors Triot's observation that savages were often stripped of all polite manners and custom, which were conceptualized as the unique jurisdiction of Western elites. The second generalization is that African farmers tend to be portrayed as capable of controlling nature and lacking in agricultural expertise, making them especially vulnerable to environmental change, not dissimilar, of course, to the portrayal of savages as closer to nature. Finally, African foodways in agriculture are often depicted as timeless and rooted in an unchanging past. Savages, too, were placed in an earlier rung of the evolutionary ladder, displacing time and denying contemporaneity. In my book, I suggest that we can use long-term histories of food security as a foil to these stereotypes and to present-day realities of food insecurity. For the purposes of brevity in this talk, what I'm going to do is illustrate my approach by putting a case study into conversation with the first and last tenets of the scarcity slot, that Africans have always lacked food and the ability to change their situations. As a corrective to the scarcity slot, I propose a longue durée history of food security in the African continent, something that we surprisingly lack as a specific area of study because the focus has been slightly different and for good reason. But I'd like to argue today that the ingredients are already there. The African continent is home to rich agricultural and environmental. As a corrective to the scarcity slot, I propose a longue durée history of food security in the African continent, the negativity and simplicity with which African agriculture has typically been viewed. Yet the time depth of many of these studies remains confined to periods characterized by intensive engagements with Europeans, making it difficult to unravel African agricultural capabilities, particularly prior to these kinds of interventions. Food history requires creative use of an array of sources beyond the written word, and especially in parts of the continent that lack early or extensive written archives. But here too, Africanists have long been innovators in making histories using a diverse array of sources. Over the last 2 decades, there's also been a strong resurgence in interest in Africa's long-term economic history, a charge so far led by economic historians interested in a so-called reversal of fortunes post-1500. But they and others have remained frustrated by the lack of data before colonial records. So in this talk, what I do is essentially make an explicit pitch for using archaeological data, particularly since we've really seen an explosion of work that's focused on documenting the last 500 years. So archaeological data can extend our food security archive in several really important and interesting ways. I'm going to highlight just a couple of these. First, we aren't really restricted by time period. We can examine virtually any time period for the whole of African history. Our data are also the material remains of people's everyday choices and activities, and so they provide a very interesting perspective then if we're thinking about how people manage to maintain food security. While I don't have time to go into specific details here, elsewhere I've developed an approach I've sort of simplified that harnesses these advantages to track changing levels of food security over time. So in short, I argue that we can document changes in food availability. This may be something that's a function of environmental conditions. If there's lower harvest, there'd be lower food availability, for example. We can also look at food access in the archaeological record, who had access to food, who did not, how accessibility changed over time. And we can also look at food preference, and this is a really important component of food security that often gets left out, but is really critical. So we can see where people are able to enjoy all the foods that they really like, or where people are less able to do so at the more insecure end of the spectrum. So the counter-narrative I'm going to present very briefly today depends on this reconstruction, which I've sort of dealt with in other publications, but I'm happy to answer specific questions as they come up. Okay, so we can't quite get the same kind of resolution on foodways as we might from, say, talking to modern people or observing the people around the room eating pizza right now. It smells really good. But there are multiple kinds of archaeological data that help us reconstruct foodways. So if we were going to visualize this data, we could take this tranquil kitchen setting from one of my favorite interviews conducted in 2009. We could just sort of use our imaginations and fast forward a few hundred years to where this becomes an archaeological site. And what we sort of end up with are remains of houses like this one. I'm sure everybody recognizes this as a house. No. So here's essentially a wall. You see a lighter interior area, which is a floor, a darker exterior area, which is where people would have been cooking and producing a lot of wood charcoal. So we can reconstruct the activities people use to sort of produce and prepare their food, how they sort of related to one another, kind of food storage, these kinds of things. We can also sort of look at the specific material remains like this pot. Pots are, of course, the central way in which people convert raw materials into food, into soups, into fufu, into rice, into all of the things we would recognize today as food. So we can look at the shapes and size of these pots as well as the residues contained within to help reconstruct sort of the more cultural side of foodways. My specific focus is looking at plant remains, so the remains of crop plants. In archaeology, they turn into these. These probably look like nothing. They're charred seeds. When seeds become charred, they preserve for very long periods of time, and this is our primary then record on changing agricultural practices over the last few millennia. We can also look at specialized techniques like this little phytolith in gray, which is a very, very small sort of plant cell-like microfossil that provides us a much more detailed glimpse. Finally, we could also look at the animal bones, the remains of people's everyday sort of meat consumption and what's discarded as a result. So we actually do have quite a lot of data then on foodways and other kinds of economic activities. So today I'm going to talk about one case study which is in west central Ghana, named Banda. Banda has been a really good place to do this kind of work for several reasons. First, it's kind of a rarity on the African continent in that we've seen sustained archaeological work there for the last 3 decades. There's an incredible body of political economic data here, largely thanks to the leadership of Anne Stahl. I was particularly fortunate that she was interested in these kinds of questions and in crop remains and sampled appropriately for them, something which is not always done at every kind of archaeological site. Banda is also located in an interesting area ecologically. It's in the transition between forest and savanna, and this means if we sort of add time to the mix here, that with changing precipitation regimes, we can see tremendous differences in what the landscape looks like. So we can sort of use this as a test case to see how people responded to different kinds of environmental changes over time. So without going into too many details here, people have been living and working in Banda over quite an extended period. We have really good high-resolution archaeological data on the last 1,000 years or so, all the way to the present day. This rich data set is essentially enabled me to look at continuity and change in foodways over what have been some of the most tumultuous and dynamic times in world history, and for better or worse, when modern global food systems took root. So my book covers the period 1400 to 2014, bolstered by an archaeological ethnography of food in the area. I am not going to have time to cover all of that today, so I'm sort of going to direct where I'm going to be able to focus. So to orient you, these phases essentially straddle some pretty important political economic shifts. These include the height of the trans-Saharan trade, of which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, as well as the gradual shift to Atlantic trade beginning in Banda in the 17th century. The area then becomes taken over by 2 successive empires, first the Asante and later the British. So today, as I said, I can't cover the whole sequence. We'd be here for a lot longer than I'm sure anyone wants to be. But I'm going to focus on the periods I've shaded in red. So these correspond to the period immediately preceding European contact, and then secondly to formal colonial rule beginning in the late 19th century. So in what follows, I'm going to give you a brief example of my approach by noting a few instances of scarcity slot reasoning in some of the literatures we've come to rely on, and then putting those stereotypes into conversation with the archaeological record as an empirical test of sorts. So in this section, I'd like to focus on the first tenet that Africans lack food as a sort of general premise. So to get into what I'm talking about a little bit more, I'm going to focus here on the introduction of American crops as part of the Columbian exchange. Now, this has been a huge topic for historians and archaeologists. We've long been fascinated by the spread of plants and animals post-Columbus. Alfred Crosby's famous book only really heightened these interests and sort of kicked off this study in a big way. Unfortunately, in this book, as in many depictions of the Columbian exchange, Africans tend to get short shrift except as a source of slaves or a source of raw material. Their agencies and pre-existing cultural developments are repeatedly silenced in several ways. So we can take, for example, this quote from Crosby, which summarizes his argument as far as Africa is concerned, and I quote, "The importance of American foods in Africa is more obvious than in any other continent of the Old World. For in no other continent except the Americas themselves is so great a proportion of the population dependent on American foods. Very few of man's cultivated plants originated in Africa, and so Africa has had to import its chief food plants from Asia and America. As for the influence of these crops before 1850, we might hypothesize that the increased food production enabled the slave trade to go on as long as it did without pumping the black well of Africa dry." Now, I could critique this argument and its quite frankly racist undertones all day, and many scholars certainly have done so when similar language has been used in other contexts. But what is remarkable about much of the literature on African foodways is that the root assumptions at play here tend to go unquestioned. While published originally in 1972, so quite a while ago, Crosby's work was substantially revised in 2003, yet this language in particular was kept intact. The key assumption Crosby makes here, based on no empirical data from what I can tell, is that Africans were in need of American crops post-1492. That Africans needed additional food because they themselves did not have adequate supplies is a truism that has sort of continued to be repeated even in much more recent works like those of James McCann, published in 2005. Clearly heavily influenced by Jared Diamond as well, McCann, an environmental historian, depicts Africans as disadvantaged by virtue of geographic inevitability, lacking enough food supplies to develop all the hallmarks of complexity. Now, this view stands in opposition to many of his other works, which tend to do an excellent job challenging stereotypes about African environmental knowledge in particular. His evidence for this particular line of argument is quite weak. He cites the relative unpopularity of African grains in the modern global food market, where Eurasian grains like wheat and rice and American maize dominate. But this pattern speaks more of very modern geopolitical relationships, as well as their impact on global food preferences, rather than the capabilities of African versus European grains. Now, both of these scholars has otherwise done exceptional work, and I want to underscore that. So perhaps what is so jarring here is that they uncritically promote the kinds of assumptions I'm trying to call attention to. This underscores to me just how pervasive assumptions of scarcity are where African food in particular is concerned. What both of these arguments have in common, though, is the lack of empirical data to support their arguments. They go largely unquestioned because they fit into this commonly held trope that Africa is a place that lacks the ability to produce enough food for itself, and thus is in need of external assistance. So what I'd like to do now is examine how crops like maize were actually adopted as an empirical test of sorts to some of these assumptions of scarcity. So most of these arguments have been based upon looking at the advantages, sort of botanically and agriculturally speaking, of American crops over African ones. This does some important analytical work, but it can sort of run the risk of effectively giving the crops themselves more agency than African farmers who chose whether or not to adopt them. I argue that considering these affordances of these various crops is important, but only really to understand the conditions under which people might have chosen to grow and eat them. So to illustrate what I mean, I've reproduced Banda's agricultural cycle as it was in 2009. I note this year here because by now things have likely changed again in terms of timing of onset of these various planting seasons. Climate change has radically altered rainfall patterns in recent decades in Banda and continues to do so not just there, but many other places in the continent. What I want to direct your attention to, though, is the seasonal production schedule of African crops, namely yams, which is at the top, pearl millet, and sorghum, which are a little bit farther down. So note that those are not ready to harvest until August at the earliest. In modern Banda, what this means in terms of thinking about a food schedule is by June and July, food supplies often run short because this is the period before African crops are ready to harvest. This period is known as the hungry season gap, which is a chronic and seasonal shortage that affects large numbers of people on the continent. So today, 2 crops from the Americas are especially important for plugging this gap. This is maize and cassava. Maize in particular is very important because 2 crops can be grown per year instead of just one. So this effectively doubles the potential amount of harvest from per hectare of land. Cassava is also something that's available year-round, and maize becomes ready to harvest right in the middle of the hungry season gap. So there are important reasons why scholars have emphasized these crops, but we have to sort of think backward a little bit and think about whether or not these affordances were actually needed in the situations and context of the past. Was the hungry season as severe as it is today to really require these kinds of crops to fill the gap? So I'm going to jump to modern times just a little bit to sort of contextualize this a little bit in terms of environmental change. As many of us are familiar, chronic and seasonal shortages like the hungry season gap act to basically make people more vulnerable to severe climatic shocks like drought. In the late 60s and early 70s, a severe drought followed by a humid period led to the severe famine throughout the Sahel known as the Sahel drought, the Sahel famine. This marked the beginning of a drying trend that has essentially continued through the present. This has had devastating impacts on food production throughout the region, including in Banda. So I'm going to ask us to add a little bit of a long-term perspective to this and ask if these effects are bad, what did it look like during this major drought, which was basically orders of magnitude more severe than what we saw in the 70s and leading up until today. This actually is the period lasting from about 1400 to 1650, pretty much precisely brackets the period when American crops like maize were introduced. So if people were as vulnerable to drought as they are today, this mega drought would have had catastrophic impacts on their ability to feed themselves. In particular, we'd expect people to make up for decreased harvest by clinging to American crops that would help plug these shortages, because that's what they're very well equipped to do. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is evaluate whether or not this is what happened in Banda. As I talked about, there's a lot of different kinds of archaeological data we can use to access foodways. Today, I'm really going to hone in on archaeological plant remains, which is my analytical specialty, but also provides a unique window into these kinds of questions. Plant remains afford us essentially a view of how people engaged with and created their environments and how they managed changing economic, environmental, and political conditions through food and agricultural practices. So the data I pictured here are based on charred plant remains, the main way we see crops in the archaeological record, and one of our best indicators of how uses in staple grains change over time. This represents basically a conglomeration of 330 samples from 10 different sites, or 10 villages is a better way to think about it. And this gives us basically a regional view of how food and agriculture changed over the last 1,000 years. So if you're trying to read this graph and you're like, what does this mean? You're not alone. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about some of the organization as well as the analytical measures I've used here to make it make sense. So along the bottom edge, we have a chronology. This is 1000 AD going to about 1920. On the top, essentially what I've done is using that graph of precipitation I've just presented, characterize what the sort of predominant sort of precipitation regimes would have been for that period. So we have dry and wet periods sort of alternating. This top graph is based on a measure we call ubiquity, and this is essentially just an index of what percentage of archaeological context do we find a certain plant in. So this helps us sort of get at how commonly a plant would have been used in the past. This down here is basically a frequency measure, so how much pearl millet or sorghum relative to the other grains is used. It helps us get at the quantity in which these different grains are used relative to one another. Okay, so now it will make sense. So what you see immediately here is that pearl millet pretty much takes the cake. It predominates for the entire sequence until we get to basically the 1890s. In many ways, this isn't a surprise. This crop is indigenous to the African continent. It's the earliest domesticated crop in the continent. We find it basically all over the place in the archaeological record, in domestic contexts, and ritual ones as well. Indeed, today it remains one of the most ritually potent crops in the region. The next crop is sorghum. This is another African grain, but its patterning is a little bit different. It's present, but it's used more in wet periods than in dry ones. So that's what these arrows are meant to depict. But you see dry period, little sorghum. Wet period, lots of sorghum. Dry period, little sorghum, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you're a farmer. This is because you can grow sorghum even in the wettest of conditions. You could also perform very well in arid conditions. But the issue here is actually pearl millet. Pearl millet actually doesn't do very well with a lot of water. So what farmers seem to be adjusting for is growing more sorghum in the wet periods to account for potentially lower millet harvests. What's actually very interesting about these data is that millet is grown at all in this region. It's actually adapted to much more dry environments. Banda lies outside of the place where you can grow pearl millet optimally. So I might use this to make an argument for pearl millet actually being a preferred food. It's one with great antiquity, it's one with great meaning and great power. Anytime you do archaeology in moist, humid, tropical forest Africa, you find pearl millet, and it should not be there, it should not be growing there. So this is something that people are not doing because it's optimal, but because it's what is of value to them. So finally, this is our maize patterning. It is introduced very early. The earliest direct dates I have on this date we can bracket between 1590 and 1650. This is a very, very fast adoption inland, considering it's on the coast, basically in the mid-1500s, and makes its way 400 kilometers inland very, very quickly. But notice that it's used in very, very little periods. Very, very little amounts. So this is that period of drought I've been talking about, and you can see maize is basically hardly used at all when it's first introduced. Even if you jump a couple hundred years later, people are still using it in minor amounts compared to African grain sorghum and millet, and it's really only in this late period that we see people shifting to maize. So for hundreds of years, these sort of affordances of maize, right, its ability to produce more, and its ability to produce during the hunger season gap, don't seem to be what are the priorities that are defining African farms. But perhaps what is most compelling about this archaeobotanical sequence is not maize or how little there is, but the pearl millet. I argue that our focus on the introduction of American crops and their affordances have silenced, in some cases, the very major role played by indigenous African grains. These grains, like pearl millet, provided food for people during what seems to have been the worst drought on record in the last millennium, and that's significant. Indeed, the focus on maize in some ways is due to a fascination with Western ideals that really privilege the production of surplus above all else. Many African farmers have different goals, or have had different goals, including that of risk reduction. So pearl millet's ability to withstand drought and maintain cultural food preferences suggests that farmers knew exactly what they were doing. The superior value of these traits is something that's been noted recently in genetic literature, some 500 years later. So as I'm going to argue the next few minutes, I think what this evidence suggests is that people weren't just getting by, they were thriving. So let me present a little bit more of that. So While this drought surely had an impact on crop production, thus food availability, and I want to emphasize that I don't think this drought had no impact on what people were able to produce agriculturally. What is interesting is that we really don't see evidence of coping mechanisms that would point to food insecurity. So we see wild plants, and that's, those are the kinds of strategies people use today to help get by in sort of rough times. But if you look at the species of these plants, they're not known famine foods. They aren't replacements for staple crops. Instead, they're things that provide taste and texture. So one example is grain of paradise, which is a really delicious peppery spice. It's a major trade item to Europe, and it comes from the West African coast. But this is something that's not, something you'd be eating in the midst of a famine, is what I'm trying to get at. The same is true if you look at another kind of data, which is from the animal bones. The species utilized seem to have been selected for novelty or rarity rather than ease of capture, which is a pattern we actually see more typical in later periods. Many of these animals, like the great white shark, which I'm just going to remind you, we're in 400 kilometers from the coast. There are no sharks in the Volta. So, this is an example of a species that has probably traded in, not for food, but as curiosities or as luxuries. We also get various predatory cats and other monkeys that come from very wet ecological zones that would have been tens of kilometers, if not hundreds of kilometers distant. So there's a trade in interesting animal species. There's also hunting, probably specialized hunting of animals in the nearby environments, because these are dangerous animals as well. So this is not, again, stuff you're going to turn to in times of need, actually quite the opposite. So in short, what I'm trying to get at is that people utilize what seem to be a diverse array of animal and plant species, local and exotic, to satisfy what seem to be quite cosmopolitan tastes. I'm sorry. Stay put here for a second. So, although pearl millets may have helped ensure adequate food supplies, Banda's socioeconomic positionality also afforded the area a degree of resilience to environmental change. We see clear evidence in the archaeological record for involvement in these northward directed trade networks, as well as evidence for what appears to be a vibrant regional trade. So we know this because we get raw materials like copper and copper alloys in Banda. The only copper sources in West Africa are found in the Sahara. So this is like, a good acquired from quite some distance, probably of quite a lot of value. We have metal workshops locally where specialized figurines and other kinds of objects are made, pointing to very skilled metal workers who were there at the time. We get beads that trickle in from across the Sahara and from as far away, potentially, as the Middle East and Central Eurasia. So, this is a very sort of vibrant, interconnected place, able to access all sorts of goods from afar. What are they sort of producing back to acquire these goods? Ivory is well attested in the archaeological record, probably traded both north and south. There are small sources of gold in the area as well, which may have also sort of helped bolster the economic viability of the area. But there's a really vibrant regional trade, and this is in stuff that people consumed on an everyday basis, like iron and pottery. People seem to have been specialized craft producers for some of these crafts. The reason that this is important is because we can tell they produced not only enough to make sure their households survived, but a surplus that could be traded. This also provides circumstantial evidence that there was probably enough food to go around. Otherwise, people who were very highly valued, like these craft specialists, could have simply voted with their feet. So this world of interconnected and productive craftspeople and traders doesn't fit easily with imaginaries of an Africa plagued by the worst drought on record for the last millennium. And this demands, to my mind, a reevaluation of the ideas that Africans were in need when Europeans landed on the coast. What tends to go overlooked in studies like those of Crosby is local context. And this effectively acts to sanitize the historical record of African knowledges, desires, and agencies. By the time Columbus landed in the Caribbean islands, West Africa had for centuries been the hub of some of the most lucrative trade networks in the world. These networks moved goods, including foods, from the Middle East and Europe into Africa and vice versa, as well as between ecological zones in West Africa. The best known character in these exchanges in which, I'm sorry, my computer wants me to go faster. The best known character in this exchange is, of course, Mansa Musa, with which we're all familiar, the king of Mali, who made a pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century and reportedly gave away so much gold that it depressed world markets. Well, Musa's experience certainly did not define the experiences of every African at the time. Tales like these really do act to paint a much different imaginary of Africa than the scarcity mentality allows for. So it was, of course, the very promise of bountiful resources that lured European explorers to West African coastlines in the 15th century. But the positionality of some Africans was to change dramatically in the centuries to follow, as Europeans shifted from trade in gold and other commodities to human beings. This trade peaked in Ghana itself in the 18th century. So while I have data that pertain to this period, what I'm going to do is actually jump ahead to the 19th century to begin to talk about how such changes became flattened into stereotypes of timelessness. So by the 19th century, Africa was still viewed by many as a land of abundance, but her people started to be viewed more pejoratively. By the onset of colonial rule in the late 19th century, many officials adhered to the myth of tropical exuberance, the idea that African environments were rich and overflowing in resources, but that African people lacked the will or the way to effectively control and mine them. This view effectively invoked a historical amnesia of sorts, ignoring centuries of slaving that had upended whole villages and dramatically reduced population in some areas, with, of course, major impacts on agricultural production. This ahistorical colonial ideology essentially helped justify exploitation of African resources while simultaneously ignoring food and agriculture, since it was assumed that these very rich tropical environments, of course, yielded ample food supplies without Africans having to really try very hard. What this meant was that beginning in 1896, when the British first extended rule over much of the new Gold Coast colony, until the early 20th century, there was very little attention paid to subsistence crops or nutrition. This no-policy policy towards food crops has inclined some scholars to assume that British rule had but a negligible impact on agricultural production and food security. One of the most recent manifestations of this view is provided in a recent article by economic historian Paul Schaefer. He argues that food insecurity was more a function of already existing agricultural practices and the limitations innate to African environments. So I'd like to dissect how his argument is constructed in order to, again, illustrate how scarcity tends to be reinforced by assumptions of timelessness that can be used to paper over what are apparent discrepancies in pre-colonial data. So unlike the authors I discussed in the last section, Schaefer has a much, much higher standard of data. He's absolutely to be commended for drawing on interdisciplinary sources, which include linguistics, history, and ethnography, to try and get at this issue of pre-colonial food security. His focus is on northern Ghana, today an area that suffers the worst in the country from food insecurity. Banda is closely situated in terms of colonial dynamics, though I should emphasize represents a very different sort of environmental setting and cultural setting. So his evidence for pre-colonial food insecurity derived from two European travelers who visited the area in 1899 and 1906, a few years after formal colonial rule took hold. These sources record several local words for hunger. So he uses this to argue this implies the existence of hunger, and particularly a chronic hunger season before British colonial rule. Now, he does not provide any detailed glosses, and he's not really to be faulted for this. I don't know that the data exist. But it would be helpful to know, for example, whether these words simply refer to the need to eat, like I'm hungry and that pizza smells good, or to seasonal food insecurity or severe famine. And the vast pre-colonial period effectively becomes collapsed into what two Europeans could record on their brief visits in 1899 and 1906, which actually fall 10 to 15 years after the extension of formal colonial rule. So although he acknowledges these are weak sources, he nevertheless argues that the hungry season existed in a severe form before colonial rule, despite not a single source that actually gives us this information. What is perhaps most incongruous to me is the logical gymnastics to which authors like Schaeffer go to essentially let colonial interventions off the hook. And this is in spite of what I'm going to argue is considerable evidence to the contrary. What Schaeffer does not mention is the well-known and well-documented historical context at the time, that many regions in Ghana, especially the north that is his focus, were subject to tremendous upheaval in the decades immediately preceding his sources. Now, this was a direct result of the British outlawing the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and the subsequent shift to legitimate trade goods like palm oil. These goods required considerable labor force, leading to a ramping up of the internal slave trade. At the same time, African leaders with imperial designs, people like Imam Samori, captured large parts of the interior of the subcontinent, bringing with them extreme levels of violence in some cases. Banda oral histories tell of people fleeing Samori and his advancing troops, leaving farm and home and even some relatives behind. They say they had to eat whatever they could find, trying even new species of wild leaves, one person at a time, to make sure they didn't kill them. In short, this was a period of what seems to be, by my recollection, the most severe food insecurity on record in the last millennium, though it's glossed by Schaeffer as typical of the pre-colonial period. So what I suggest here is that this period is quite the opposite of representative of food security in the entirety of the millennia-long pre-colonial period. So after decades of violence and upheaval, when people resettled in Banda in the 1890s, there was a new normal. Because of the long pre-colonial record available to us, we can see just how abnormal this pattern is, how much it stands out. Houses were made of less durable materials, trade and craft production had greatly contracted, and people had shifted to maize and perhaps cassava as a staple foods. Now, these food shifts are significant in terms of their implications for food security. Maize, as we've talked about, is one of the fastest producing crops, and cassava can be grown with very little labor. Both were likely important affordances in the low labor situations Banda people found themselves in the early colonial period. And colonial sources are replete with references to the Banda and surrounding areas as being very, very low in terms of population density, whole villages destroyed, etc. By comparing these plant data with ceramic production patterns, we actually interpret this shift as indicative of women and older individuals shouldering a greater responsibility of the farming burden. And this is particularly relevant in a context where colonial officials demanded a certain quota of men for labor to work on infrastructure projects. Maize and cassava also fulfill an important role today in bridging the hunger season gap, when crops from the previous harvest run short and before the next one is ready. Their dominance in the early colonial period, but not before, is strongly suggestive that the hungry season gap, the most prevalent kind of food scarcity in the continent even today, became much more severe in the early years of colonial rule. My goodness. Sorry, I don't know. This never happened. So Banda does not seem, though, to have been the only place that experienced a decline in food security. What I've illustrated here are data on heights from a recent study by economic historian Austin and colleagues, and a shout out here is old ode to Walter Hawthorne, who first turned me on to this great data source. So height is something that's in part genetic, as some of us are frustrated with and some of us are not, but is also strongly determined by nutrition early in life and particularly protein intake. So each of these lines basically is from a different, populations from a different region in Ghana. What is clear here, though, if you look, is, you might just have to trust me, is that there is a marked decline in men born between 1895 and 1904, which I've indicated in red. This suggests a marked increase in malnutrition during this period. And I should pause here to say that Austin and colleagues have conducted similar studies comparing these kinds of declines in Ghana in particular to elsewhere in the world. Was there just something going on in the late 19th century that sort of everybody got kind of shorter? But the declines are very pronounced in this case and in West African cases as compared to other worldwide global comparisons. So it's a really interesting and suggestive data source. I think that it's no coincidence that this correlates pretty much spot on with the time period Banda people shift to maize and cassava. Together, these data suggest a marked decline in food security, particularly in the early colonial period, and may well signal an increasingly severe hunger season. So while there's no specific policy, and Banda seems to have not been, while there was no specific policy of colonial authorities that intentionally caused food insecurity, and this would have been working against their interests as well, the interaction of local historical contingencies, as well as the laissez-faire imposition of capitalist market economies, had major impacts. As we know from Banda and elsewhere, many places were in the early stages of recovering from severe demographic collapse. Much of West Africa at this time was subject to violence and associated dislocation as various political entities attempted to establish control over new resources and people. Now, this followed on the heels of the human losses that had occurred as a result of the Atlantic slave trade over the previous 2 centuries. Colonial officials were pressured to, of course, though, make money from their new colonies. So they pushed the production of cash crops, including cocoa, especially in Ghana, and strongly encouraged market participation. And this participation included the selling of crop produce, particularly to colonial centers, as well as the purchasing of imported goods from the metropole. People, though, didn't have the labor they once did to produce what they used to, and this additional pressure to sell at market must have had impacts. Food that would have normally gotten a family throughout the year now ran short before the next harvest. People had to buy food during those shortfalls, but prices were double the norm, following the supply and demand logic of capitalist markets. And indeed, colonial registers are full of these kinds of price reports that show this same dynamic. Many people would take to borrowing to feed their families, but this meant that they were pressured to sell their harvest off as soon as they were ready to repay those loans, which fetched then the lowest price possible. The next year, they often would find themselves in a similar situation. Market economies tend to be very unforgiving when it comes to hunger because they have an inertia all their own. Once experienced, it becomes very difficult to escape the cycle. It took 4 decades for colonial officials to realize that they had a major nutritional crisis on their hands. Beginning in the 1930s, medical officers armed with the techniques of a new nutritional science found alarmingly high levels of malnutrition in parts of the African colonies. Dr. Purcell was assigned to Ghana, and the image depicted here is from his grisly 1939 report that systematically linked poor nutrition and health problems. Now, I selected this picture as the least graphic among them by far, but one which I think still bears witness to the tragic nutritional deficiencies of the era. Some colonies responded by creating new national food policies, but others prevented these reports from ever seeing the light of day and did little. The British Gold Coast was unfortunately amongst the latter. Purcell was in fact dispatched to complete a nutritional survey of northern Ghana, where in the early 40s, so after this study, he found much more severe nutritional deficiencies than reported in his 1939 report based on the coast. But his write-up on northern Ghana was prevented from being published, since it made the colony look bad. As one official scrawled on his draft report, "No one may starve in the British Empire." Instead, these deficiencies were recast not as a problem of empire, but as a natural feature of African environments and their backward agricultural practices, a recasting which has remained remarkably tenacious and popular at even some scholarly circles. Yet archaeological reconstructions of food security suggest a very different pattern, one which not only challenges the idea that the hungry season gap is a natural part of the agricultural cycle, but which points a determined finger at colonial negligence. In this way, I propose that archaeology in the past, as overall, be used as an active corrective to the forced forgetting that was and is part and parcel of the colonial project. Although I've only covered them in brief today, what these data show is a relatively high level of food security during the worst drought on record in the last millennium, suggesting a high degree of resilience to environmental change that was somehow lost before now. That moment of loss seems to be in the 19th and early 20th century, as violence, both political and structural, plagued the countryside. I'm not alone, of course, and I'm not the first to argue that the colonial project had devastating impacts on food security in the colonies. My data reinforce and extend what political ecologists like Michael Watts and Mike Davis have shown in other regions, that colonial interventions and their market prerogatives have had devastating impacts on local food security. Davis, focusing on India, also shows how colonial officials repeatedly and deliberately silenced the severity of famines induced by colonial policies to save face at home. Archaeology allows us to begin to overturn those silences, but also allows us to do something more by demonstrating a high food security in the centuries before European interventions. We can also provide a temporality, a long temporality, that allows us a glimpse at processes that occur over the long durée. I argue that the emergence of chronic food insecurity is akin to what Rob Nixon has called slow violence. Quote, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that's not typically viewed as violence at all, end quote. Those deeply enmeshed in turbo-capitalism with its attendant focus on the fast pace and the catastrophic tend to overlook these kinds of gradual and slow processes of change. But overlooking slow violence decouples them from their causes with serious consequences for how we envision their solutions. Wow. The image of timeless Africa remains particularly tenacious in many popular accounts, where it can do very serious damage. This is especially the case for food security. So here I quote from a journalist best-selling account of an NGO working in East Africa, which is very typical of this genre. Modern farmers are portrayed as toiling away in a time warp, denying contemporaneity to the tragedies of the present that are very much informed by the past. Such images portray food insecurity as fixable with the right technological training. But in so doing, they minimize the histories of creative agricultural responses that African farmers have made to drought and to economic change. Even more alarming, they depoliticize food insecurity, rerouting blame away from a flawed world system to technologically backward African farmers. Archaeology provides one means of building alternative narratives that can help challenge these dominant modes of thinking with empirical data. In my book, I focus on tracking capabilities and culpabilities over time to build a new narrative of African food history that aims to jar and upset figures like this one. Put another way, this approach attends to the unfolding of structural violence over time, as high potential for food security was eroded away through centuries of marginalization. But this is not a unidirectional narrative. For the capabilities of people to survive the most trying of environmental, economic, and political challenges is clear in recent times as well. My goodness. So in the last couple chapters of the book, I return to the last few decades and consider how people in Banda negotiate both a hunger for modernity and actual seasonal hunger. Local foods continue to play an important role in this negotiation, though they are dramatically undervalued today. What I hope has come through in this talk, though, is that we need to rethink these value systems and think of how the past can be effectively put to work for the present. Last but not least, thanks to these funders and individuals who have made this study possible, and to you all for listening. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Now, anybody who has questions, comments, just raise your hand and we'll be able to toss the microphone.
Yeah, remember, those of you that aren't familiar with Eye on Africa, please speak your question into the microphone. It's not an amplifier, but it's for the live stream so that people can hear your voice.
Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I was just wondering, you may have no idea about this, but in comparison to other parts of West Africa or Africa more broadly, how would this compare on a larger scale? You did a really great job sort of sketching out these things in a particular place, but I'm just thinking more broadly.
Great question. That's the next book. Here's my short answer. There's some really tantalizing clues out there. The work that immediately comes to mind is Elias Mandala's in Malawi, which essentially makes a similar, and Watts in Nigeria, which make a similar argument for a decline, Watts focuses specifically on food security, Mandala more on agricultural history, but they make a fairly compelling arguments for negative impacts from colonial interventions. The Henrietta Moore and Vaughn sort of re-study of Audrey Richards' work in Zambia as well also sort of show some of the intricacies of how colonial policies had intended and unintended effects on sort of people's ability to, have productive agriculture. I think there's a lot of really good data for the colonial period. I think what we actually really miss and we lack is what's going on before European interventions in those first few centuries, right, when the power dynamics are really, really different and agricultural policy is not transitioning to full-on capitalist market economy is not, it's a very long process. There are a lot of tantalizing clues as well, though, in the archaeology. So we can think of Great Zimbabwe as sort of the classic example of big African empires that, faced actually pretty devastating environmental changes, yet seem to not have immediately collapsed, seem to have thrived in many circumstances. I'm currently now in a new project working at Ile-Ife in Nigeria, which is another major urban population, a real center of trade during trans-Saharan trade. The existence of these big cities and big populations suggests people had the agriculture figured out. I'm not saying, though, that everybody had equal access to that, and so that's sort of one of the driving questions for the next stage. But it's a good question.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to find out in terms of your positionality. There is during your talk you use the pronoun we when talking about Banda, and just right now when you're talking about Great Zimbabwe you shift to they. So I'm trying to understand how you navigate this space. How do you get yourself included, excluded in what you do in your research? And if you could also talk a little bit, I think it was a constraint about time, but could you talk a little bit about the process itself for doing the research? How did you do it? How much time you spent on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, which are really important. I can't say I have the they figured out completely, but I'll just take the stage here to acknowledge my privileged positionality as an American researcher coming into a place that is not my home and the privileges I've gained from growing up elsewhere. That said, I have worked closely with the Banda community over the last decade, I suppose, and so I sort of tend to shift a little bit as I put myself there. This is a complicated question too, though, because what I sort of realized in doing this project is it's not kind of up to me, knowing this information, what we could do with it moving forward. I'm publishing the book open access as well as hoping to develop more significant web components, in part because I don't think what we do with this is actually for me to say. So it's a complicated dynamic I haven't completely figured out. In terms of the research process, I did quite a bit of community archaeology as well as what I'm calling an archaeological ethnography of food in the area, where I was basically talking to primarily women, but also some men about changes they've seen in food practices and agriculture over their generations, but also between their generations and the ones that came before them. I didn't talk about any of that today, but that is really informing a lot of what some of my conclusions are. I devote the last couple chapters of the book to that because there's this real sense in Banda today that although old foods like made of pearl millet or made of sorghum are good and good for the body and more nutritious than a lot of the foods coming in through global trade and through urban centers like rice, that they're kind of not modern and not desirable and of no value. And again, this is not, I like to be there to provoke that conversation, but where things go from here is not my right to do. So I've done a lot of sort of on-the-ground events on olden times foods and also presenting the main findings of this research back to just try and spur focus groups and other kinds of conversations about what could happen. So some of the conversations we've been having could we take some of these olden times foods and, as the youth suggest, put them in plastic and put a label on them and make them hygienic and modern looking, and therefore sort of have this sort of hybrid take on what new African food looks like, new old food.
Thank you again for your great presentation this afternoon. And the last bit of your response to Benu's question touched on the question I had, which really talks about the fact that other than maize, the imported foods that have come to Africa, wheat and rice, have not really been grown at a large scale in Africa. They've not really localized in terms of production. And in fact, Africa continues to import a lot of food. So it really raises the issue of, is there a way back to the African foods, the sort of quote-unquote indigenous foods, and how one does that in this context of westernized tastes. And I think that's where history really begins to speak to development, switching to the need to take historical lessons and applying those lessons to solving problems today. One of the things that I've noticed is that places such as the Caribbean, there's a lot of reliance on fruit. When people are poor, they have fruit. Every home, every community is awash with plants. I don't see that in Africa as much. We don't have that fruit culture, which really I think is another way that food security, food issues can be addressed. So I just wanted to throw those things as challenges for today's African communities and the way forward for food.
Great series of provocations. One of the challenges is something that I think Jim Ferguson describes really well in Southern Africa, the idea that, old practices or the olden times way of doing things, even though they may have advantages and be more sustainable in the long run, are not oftentimes what local people want to do because they're considered not modern. And the same is absolutely true when you talk about foodways from the past. The youth are kind of like, my grandma makes that, food from the days of ignorance, why would you put that upon me, right? And it's made me realize that, though I sort of have a fondness for the past and can see some advantages to eating African foods, for example, as opposed to these imported ones, and I return to my previous answer, it's not for me to decide. But also, secondarily, we have to sort of acknowledge that uniquely African modernities that mean there is not a desire to return to the past, but maybe some aspects of it. So actually part of the reason I had put this picture in here, this is a specific food called fura, and this is it's so delicious. It was unlike anything I've tasted in West Africa before, which is, in some places rice dominated, in some places fufu, so pounded starch. This is pearl millet that is fermented and ground and boiled and re-ground. Spices are added, which kind of give it a taste of pumpkin pie is the closest equivalency I can come up for a U.S. audience, but sort of these medieval spices, peppers and cloves, and a lot of these are collected wild from the bush. This is eaten then today with nido or canned milk. But this was a chief's food in the past. It's incredibly laborious to prepare, of course, which gives it a lot of its value. But when I ran these focus groups with youth and as well as with the elder women who basically ran this event, they suggested bringing back foods like this that sort of were conjured a kind of elite past, a past to be proud of, would be acceptable things to sort of bring back. Whereas many other foods during this event, and we did 14, the women prepared 14 different foods, were things from times of poverty, right? Using various fermented seeds and as a replacement for meat. The youth had no interest in that, right? That was just a reminder of something they were their modern selves were trying to get past, which was, food insecurity. But it's interesting, right? Because the old ladies would say, I want my granddaughters to know how to prepare this, so in case they're ever faced with the same kinds of challenges, this, kind of is the fruit example you brought up. They'll know how to prepare and do these. But, there's a real clash there, and something which I suspect has to be worked out compound by compound.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. This is very rich and interesting. And just as a comment, quite a while ago, we had scholars like Melissa Leach and James Fairhead challenging colonial narratives about deforestation and the expansion of the desert and blaming African practices for these negative climate outcomes. And they disproved that using some innovative but more contemporary methodology like satellite images. So I see your work as kind of bringing in another layer of method along the lines of what linguistics may be doing, like Schoenbrunn and Caroline and people like that. So yeah, it's very valuable to see this kind of thing continuing. I wonder if you could say more about the gender dimension. You showed a slide that had some trade things and said this was, you started speaking about gender when there were some
other things up
there, and I'm not sure if they were related, or if you could say a little bit more about how do you learn about gender from the methodology that you use?
Great question. My first answer is it's really hard, because what you don't want to do, and what archaeologists have been guilty of doing in the past, is we want to get a gender, feminism, great, but then how do we do that with reasoning up from these material remains? Often you have to make some kind of assumptions or stereotypes even, right? So you might look at how women make food today and sort of then project back in the past and see if you find similar, material remnants of activities. It must have been a woman doing it. We don't like that anymore, because that runs the risk of creating exactly the same kind of timeless images that I'm critiquing and many others have before me. What I was referring to is actually a paper I did a few years ago on what I call gendered taskscapes. And what we did was compare, I do plant remains, and we archaeologists are, really specialized, and another into material types, which must sound ridiculous to all of you because people use, multiple material types in their daily lives. But so we sat down and said, okay, let's try to compare our data between ceramics, the primary way in which food is, prepared, with the actual plant remains, the remnants of the foods themselves, and see if we can sort of track changes over time. So one thing we've noticed in the present day in our sort of ethnographies of the area is that, women tend to be part-time specialists. Women tend to be the people who produce pots, right? They also cook food. So if you're going to produce a pot, you aren't going to necessarily get a whole new set of tools to do that. You're going to use the ones that are on hand and the techniques and tools that are familiar to you from producing food. So archaeologically, we can see then shifts. We see shifts at the same time in pottery temper, for example, so the texture of pottery and the inclusions, and in the kinds of foods produced. We can make an argument that perhaps that was women, or men for that matter, who were responsible for both. So I wouldn't go very far back into the past using this method because, again, those same kinds of essentialism, but we managed in that paper to go back to the 1890s. Perhaps even we made an argument for a more limited argument back into the 1820s on changing gender roles. So in that 1890s to 1920s period, by using this method, we're able to sort of get at women seem to be taking on a lot more of the activities. So they're producing, the pottery becomes stuff you can just produce as quick as possible. All the sort of fancy decoration, the diversity of forms, everything just contracts dramatically. That's the same time as we see the shift to maize and cassava, which would make sense in low labor. Both are pointing to perhaps low labor situations. Maybe women doing more, maybe older individuals doing more as well. But that's kind of the best resolution. And that's kind of, to be honest, not to pump up the study, kind of the state of the art of what we're able to do as archaeologists. Like we actually go much further than that comfortably. Yeah, but it's great questions.
You've mentioned it a couple times, but could you maybe explain a little bit more what's happening in these food fair pictures? What does olden times food mean? Is it the grandparents' food, or is it? You're reconstructing from archaeology?
Yeah. Great question. So what this is from my interviews is primarily foods that basically their grandparents would have made and continue to make sometimes sort of in the privacy of their own homes. So these were foods I had actually interviewed women about 5 years previous to when these photos are taken, because I was trying to understand changes in foodways, like how do they occur? Do you just get new ingredients and make the same stuff? All these very different, very specific kinds of questions. So I got somebody to go back and do this olden times food fair, and this was part, I should say, of a larger sort of remembering the past celebration that presented some of the data I have talked about today, but also some other insights from the archaeological project as a whole. And this is just a one-day event. It took a month or more of preparation and talking with the local collaborators and redoing posters that, met what they liked and, having discussions, which really was the meat of it for me. But we sort of expected, we have a cultural center, sort of a building that Ann Stahl's built over many years of working there. And it's, it's a pretty large space, maybe 4 times the size of this room. I expected maybe 50 people would show up to this thing, and over 400 did. And there wasn't room to move. I mean, it was incredible. But what the olden times food fair part of it is that the female elders got together, and I said, I knew what a lot of the old foods were because I'd interviewed about them, but I said, pick what foods you want to make. We'll bring this stuff in to do so. And they all moved their kitchens, their street stone hearths right in front of the cultural center, and started really early in the morning making these foods. And I said, well, you don't need to do that. You can make them at home. I'm just going to move your kitchen. And the Queen Mother was like, no. This needs to be for all to see. Because they wanted to, provoke interest in making these kinds of foods. And me being there, and this gets back to the us-we question, as a foreigner taking interest in what these sort of quite marginalized old ladies were doing, helped also, I don't really like this aspect, but it helped raise the stature of what they were doing, I guess, raise attention to it. But what it also did, and this was really clever on the Queen Mother's part, is we heard chatter during the event like, should we eat these foods? Are they bewitched? Are they poison? Whatever. But then they would have conversations and be like, well, no, but they made them out in public. So they wouldn't have had time to bewitch or poison them because they're made. So she was also sort of heading off at the pass, a stigma that's commonly associated with what old ladies do, right? They're very spiritually liminal sort of figures in some cases, that these were poison foods. It's a really, the engagements were just so rich. And it was after this that I said, okay, I have to write the book that tries to connect this with the deeper past and tries to pull something out of it. Yeah.
So fascinating, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question.
So I have what I fear may be an unanswerable question. You talked mostly about grains and crops, sort of more sedentary things, but sort of what role do pastoralists play in this story, or is there, I think there's probably, I don't know, but there's probably harder to get an archaeological record for dairy than with plant remains or anything like that, but maybe with animal bones you could sort of see the prevalence of cattle herding and things like that.
Good question. Not impossible. I don't have the data in a slide with me, but we have great animal bones. We have thousands and tens of thousands of animal bones, which were analysis was done by Peter Stahl, so is not my specific area. But we did a paper recently comparing animal bones and plant remains, right? And again, this is like, you guys are like, of course, people use these in everyday lives. But for archaeologists, we don't often just sit down and compare what we have because it's really hard. Like quantitatively, it's really, really hard. One of the quick answers to your question is this area is essentially too humid for pastoralists to be there for any length of time. It's within the tsetse fly zone. But one of the hypotheses we had is maybe during this drought, it actually pushed the tsetse line farther south, and so people could actively do things like dairy or have pastoralists nearby with herds. But the data the animal bone data don't support that. So that was an interesting finding. We do, and what animal bone data I did not show is the majority of what we have are during this drought period and in the period immediately after, people seem to be eating a lot of domesticates, right? Cows, sheep, goat. This declines very dramatically, though it seems not to be for environmental reasons, by the early 19th century when people shift to eating stuff that's very easy to acquire. So like pest of agricultural fields. That you're out in your field working, you kill it, you bring it back home. There's none of this, the crazy stuff like the monkeys and great white sharks, the predatory cats, and much less of those big domesticated animals, which tend to be more preferred, have been actually for quite some time. So the animal bone data also provides a sort of complementary line of evidence to the general argument. Dairying, we can do it. I'll probably not practice here, but we do have the technology archaeologists do to get at it. It's not easy though. Anyone else?
Okay. Well, really thank you, Amanda. That was really good. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And we have pizza here. If you have it yourself, don't forget pizza. And, okay, so at 4 o'clock, we have a forum, a panel discussion about publishing about Africa and Africans. So it's by we have Noanda Achebe and other people. So if you're interested, it's at 4 o'clock today. We also have something here, what is it? Mobilizing data in the transformation to a knowledge society. So the Vice Chancellor from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, is coming to MSU, and that's gonna be Monday, September 16th, 2019, from 3:15 to 4 p.m. So if you are interested, and what else do we have here? We have also a book launch, and it's today also from 6 to 8 p.m. today. So we have a lot of things going on today and in September. So come back and listen. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. You didn't want to sleep.